Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my last of this series, Darren Shan reread video. In this one I'm going to be discussing the Saga of Larten Crepsley, Book 4, Brothers to the Death. So yes, this series is only 4 books long, so this is our finale, and as far as I'm aware, it is the last book in this Darren Shan kind of vampire universe, basically. All of his other books are like in other series or are kind of more one-off books. But let's get into it here. So we've had a lot of build-up from the previous 3 books, and especially going from book 3 into book 4. We had the big cliffhanger of Larten basically giving the knife to Gavner and saying, "Pass judgment on me," after just admitting that he was the one who killed Gavner's biological parents, and what had just happened with the whole kind of Tannish incident right at the end of that book as well. Interestingly, and if you had like a first edition copy of this, you get the first chapter of book 4 in book 3, so you could read this in that book anyway. But the reveal is just that they don't even particularly go over necessarily the incident as such. It's just we cut straight to Gavner has made his choice. And there's always that sense that because this is a prequel, there is the expectation that you've read the saga, so you know Gavner doesn't kill Larten in this moment. And ultimately it makes sense because he realized right at the end that he was betrayed and lied to by Tannish for much of his life, and that even though he has reasons to hate and dislike Larten, he does ultimately still care about Larten and wants to impress him, as we see throughout a lot of that book and a lot of this book. And so this is the situation that we get. This is Gavner becoming Larten's assistant, and the first chapters of the book are really good because you see that Larten actually has this really strong friendship with Alicia. Gavner, because like Silva is basically like his sister, they have a strong relationship, and it's just this kind of odd family dynamic, but it really works, and it's this peaceful time for them, even though it's basically the start of World War II, which is kind of where like the timeline is in this book. And so as we jump in and away from the sort of fun kind of character moments right at the start, just one final note on that is just that I really like how the writing is for, you know, the contrast between a vampire and the way they age versus this is now Larten kind of dealing with a kind of much older Alicia now, and how he kind of handles that situation. And it's much the same with how they handle later on in the book when we time skip ahead much further. Larten dealing with like an older Silva as well, really highlighting the contrast of the passage of time between them. That's always nice to see, and how, you know, he met her when she was relatively young, and now here he is like towards the end of her life, and he's much the same. She's completely changed, that she's had a whole lifetime, but to Larten it's not that much time. That was interesting just to see that he can have that same relationship with her, even though the time works differently for both of them. But because it's World War II, we straight away get into this idea of the vampires, led by Prince Mika here, are actually going to negotiate with the Nazis in all of this. And this is a very interesting part of the book, because we basically have Larten, Gavner, Mika, and Ara going to negotiate on behalf of vampires with the Nazis. They want the vampires to sort of join their cause, because they see the vampires as actually being somewhat similar to them, and obviously they have much darker goals of basically wanting to have Nazis get blooded, and so they'd have, you know, supernaturally powerful Nazis basically. So this is the contrast here of, like, you know, how do the vampires handle like a political situation that actually sort of spans the globe, that, you know, even if it won't directly lead to, you know, Vampire Mountain being attacked or something like that, this ultimately does affect vampires across the globe. So like in a way, like a major decision does need to be made about how vampires handle World War II and handle the Nazis. And it is interesting that they make the decision to ultimately like stay out of the war and not really like assist either side and just, you know, protect vampires basically. But in their negotiations with the Nazis here, they have to be careful to be like refuse them, but refuse them in like the right way. And there's some interesting stuff that happens here. Mika is obviously the perfect kind of politician, as we've sort of known in terms of how he came to be a prince from the previous books. But you see here, he sort of takes the approach of like, okay, I want Larten with me because I actually think Larten has good opinions. And because he can't be seen as the prince to just openly like despise the Nazis, he sort of lets his, you know, assistant with him on this negotiation, Larten, be the one to voice his displeasure. And it's probably one of the better written kind of parts of the book. Not that the overall book isn't well written, but just it kind of really stands out, kind of the dialogue here of basically what Larten kind of says in terms of his view on the Nazis. It's just like, I dislike and distrust them. They are cruel. Vampires are hard, yes. We ask much of ourselves and those who would be part of the clan. We execute the mad, the weak, the injured, the old, and urge them to make an end of their own. In that respect, we are like these humans. But those we treat harshly have chosen the path of the night. They left their human ways behind when they joined the clan. They understand why we treat them so piteously. They acknowledge our rule, live by our laws, accept death when they are no longer fit to fight. The enemies, no, the victims of the Nazis have no such choice. These people hate without reason. They pass judgment on innocence. In that way we differ. Vampires are harsh, Nazis are vicious. We are merciless, they are monstrous. And I just thought that was like pretty well written in terms of like wondering, okay, where's this going? And then Larten kind of gives the perspective that actually most vampires end up actually agreeing with. And it becomes like a noted thing with him that what he said in the middle of these negotiations is something that kind of really drastically improves his opinion within the kind of ranks of the clan. That people remember what he said and agreed with him, and you know the way he worded it so kind of nicely, basically. But the result of this is that Mika's just like, okay, I'll give you the decision tomorrow, and then he agrees to this plan with Larten where it's like, we can't even give him the answer. We're just gonna leave, basically. But you stay here and act like you're going to make a decision, and then just leave when you think they're going to like actually like attack you. Then I need you to basically lead them on a wild goose chase. Let them follow you, so don't just completely escape them. Waste their time, basically. And like this is the best way to sort of handle this overall. That way they still sort of feel they can sort of capture a vampire and get something done instead of actively going after like all vampires. Now, ultimately, as the book goes on, we find out that there are kind of incidents that happen that aren't super important to the plot, but you know, it's noted that they happen, that Nazis do capture vampires when they find them and try to make things happen, of course. But you know, the idea here is that ultimately they manage to escape. But this means Larten and Gavner are sort of on their own, just running from the Nazis. But in the middle of all of this, they do sort of find out that they probably do need to go to see Alicia and Silva, because they hear kind of that something has happened. I think this is when they meet Mr. Tiny, who more or less kind of alludes to some of this stuff, and that like, oh hey, you'll meet up with like Wester soon as well. It's during this meeting as well, is it's the first time in this series that we see the little people. So that's just a nice little thing, and it just kind of explains, I suppose, that oh yeah, there were no little people with the Cirque du Freak in the book up to now when we've gone to the Cirque du Freak, but specifically they are put with the Cirque du Freak because Mr. Tiny wants basically people to help protect and almost act as security for the performers of the Cirque du Freak, because of course Mr. Tall is his son as well. So all of that stuff is kind of very, very interesting. And yeah, when Wester is the one, when he meets up with them, who tells them that, okay, you know, I'm losing my support within the vampire cause for, you know, my want to go to war against the Vampanese. So this thing that was building in mostly, I think, the last book, we see has actually fallen apart a little bit. That the people he thought would support him won't support him, and he really wants Larten to support him, and he feels that Larten could actually shift the tides to actually make vampires realize they need to go to war with the Vampanese. But Larten refuses, as we've known is his opinion for most of the series up to now. But then he does kind of drop on them the idea that he's heard tale that Randall Chain is after Mr. Crepsley now because of their previous kind of encounter, and that people close to you are likely in danger. So it's this kind of weird situation where they're still in the middle of kind of leading the Nazis on a wild goose chase, but now there's this kind of contrast between, do we do this or do we go to protect the people that we care about? And Larten ultimately sticks to, you know, on the mission, that this is what they have to do. It creates a little bit of a rift between him and Gavner. Nothing too serious, but it's just, I think, in character for Gavner to oppose this decision being made. But basically what happens is as the chase basically gets them to France, they do decide to actually check in on what's going on. And this is when the big discovery of the book actually happens, which is that they find that Alicia has been killed. And they assume, because of what they were told from before, that it was Randall Chain. And so this is this big turning point in the book, that Mr. Crepsley is so upset about what has happened here that he now has grown to hate Vampanese almost just as much as Wester because of this specific incident. Now, Silva is okay, and we see that given the time that has passed, she has a similar moment to her mother, basically, when she first, told Larten to go away, and that she doesn't blame him, but she wants no part of vampires being involved. She's a bit more willing to talk to Gavner because they kind of had that closer relationship, more or less being siblings. And so she does roughly in the background agree that we can meet up at some point in the future. She's not quite ready to see Mr. Crepsley yet, but Gavner can come to see her. And this is an interesting turn in the book, because you feel like, oh no, another kind of crisis of confidence for Larten, another time when he's gone off the trail again. And it can be a little bit frustrating because a lot of the other books have been about sort of stuff like this happening. And in a way, reading it again, I kind of felt that way until you connect the entire book together and kind of realize that this has all been sort of like manipulated. It's all part of a plan, ultimately by Wester. And in that sense, it all actually, I think, comes together very nicely, because this is not, Larten just reacting badly to almost like a random incident. It's someone close to Larten purposefully manipulating the situation, killing someone Larten really cares about just to get his support, which is actually what happens here. And this is what's so interesting about this, is that Wester is this weird character in a way in this series, where he is a noted character because he has known Mr. Crepsley so long, and you know that they are like brothers, that this is effectively the Hurston kind of replacement character almost within the series. That's the way that this is, in that Mr. Crepsley is much more powerful, has much more potential as a vampire than Wester does. So there's no real threat to Mr. Crepsley from Wester, and that they make it inherently clear throughout the entire book that that is the case. So they're not really on the same level, but because they're close. But then it's also unusual that Wester isn't massively involved in most of the books. in that there are whole giant sections of Larten's life where he doesn't see Wester. Wester isn't involved in the story. And you sort of wonder, like, is that the right way to do this or not? But I do like it because obviously this is similar to what we saw before. Like, say, Steve wasn't in the original series for, like, 5 of the first, like, 7 books or something like that. And I think it's meant to be something similar here, that it's almost been this thing of, like, anytime someone mentions Wester, it's just like, oh, there he is off to the side doing his hating the Vampanese thing, their little club over there that's not really getting anything done. But in reality, is anyone actually looking close enough at this to realize that this is a proper problem, the level to which Wester is actually obsessed with wanting to go to war with the Vampanese? Because it's not just that he wants revenge against one specific person, which is what Larten wants, and then Wester effectively takes advantage of Larten's grief to apply full hatred of all Vampanese onto just wanting to hunt basically Randall Chain, who himself is a unusual character, because you see him in maybe 2 scenes, and as an individual character, he does not stand out really, like, at all. He is just basically a Vampanese. But he is such a focus point of this book for, like, multiple characters, just because of, like, like, initial scenes and stuff like that. It's hard to, kind of almost, like, make that contrast and kind of believe, like, oh yeah, this is the case. This character who is in basically, like, 2 scenes actually is more than that. In that, they tried to make it out that, like, Randall Chain actually has a big grudge against Mr. Crepsley, but the idea is I don't think he particularly did at all. So we know that ultimately Wester, his enemy who killed his family, was actually Murloc, who doesn't come back in this book at all, because obviously he has to be dealt with in book 3 of the main series. But just, it's really interesting to note that Randall Chain gets mentioned so much in this book, but the reality of it is that he's been dead for a very long time. And so a lot of the reveals towards the end of the book I actually think work quite well. And the fact that Wester, in a way, isn't the most notable character in the series, I think makes it almost more kind of brutal of a reveal that this has happened, because you do almost just see it as, like, Wester hates the Vampanese, but you don't think of it as being a true, this character is driven by hatred, look what he's doing. He almost comes across a little bit almost like kind of pathetic, almost, that, like, he can't in any way let go, that otherwise things are going well for him in Vampire Mountain. It's just he can't let go of this thing, but he doesn't seem skilled enough to actually do anything. But here, because Mr. Crepsley is a vampire on the rise, suddenly Wester's ideals have someone who can draw people in. And that's why we get this really kind of, like, weird section of the book where it's clear that Mr. Crepsley is just sort of, like, parroting what Wester is telling him to say, basically. He doesn't truly believe it because, again, his goal is specifically Randall Chain, and in a specific incident about what happens, that he sort of lets develop into something more. But it's clear he doesn't hate the overall Vampanese as much as Wester does, but he's allowed to be kind of manipulated like this. And this is an interesting thing, because in the middle of all of this, like, you had moments, like, earlier on in the book, I forgot to mention, right before they left to start on the kind of Nazi kind of wild goose chase, Ara did propose the idea that we should kind of begin to mate at this point. Let's make an agreement for a certain amount of years that we'll do this. But Mr. Crepsley doesn't go for it because at that point Alicia was still alive. And then ultimately what we're going to see here is that they use the sort of return of that as the thing that sort of snaps Mr. Crepsley out of that, in combination with, I suppose, basically what happens next in the book, which is that Vancha finds out what Mr. Crepsley is doing and sort of, like, kind of interrogates him a little bit about it. And he realizes that, like, oh, you're just, copying what Wester says. I don't like that, because I get that you have, like, an issue with the Vampanese, but I don't like that you're basically lying because you don't feel the exact same way that Wester does. And because of that, he gets quite aggressive with him, to the point where, like, he really, like, insults Mr. Crepsley, and I think insults Alicia as well. And so those two have a vicious fight. It's probably the individual one-off fight in, like, the entirety of the Saga of Larten Crepsley that is probably given, like, the most time, because it's between two really, really powerful vampires here. And it's pretty brutal, actually, because, like, they pretty much describe that, like, okay, there's a lot of dodging going on, but every time they connect, like, bones are breaking, cuts are happening all over the place. Eventually, Vancha wins. And it's an interesting one, the way they would kind of frame this, of, like, everyone who watches the fight views it as Larten got so close to defeating, basically, the best fighter in Vampire Mountain, in the clan. So, Larten doesn't lose anything for losing this fight, basically. In fact, his stock actually goes up and up. But Larten himself kind of views it as, like, I never really had a chance in that fight, even though it kind of looks that way from the outside. But it's an interesting one to actually consider the way it is. But the idea ultimately is that Larten is one of the best fighters in the clan, and to lose to the best in the clan is no real issue. It is this beating that finally sort of, in a way, slaps some sense into him. While he's recovering from all his broken bones, he realizes that, like, yeah, what I'm doing is wrong because I don't fully agree with Wester. So in the aftermath of this, he makes the decision to not completely abandon his thoughts, and that he still wants revenge against Randall, but he more focuses on that specifically. And he still is like, ultimately, if people ask me, I will say I support Wester and want to go to war with the Vampanese, but I'm not going to actively, like, campaign for it and be giving speeches like he was before. So that's all pretty cool, and makes a whole lot of sense. And right at the end of this is when Ara comes back, and this is the time at which she makes the decision for him and is basically like, we're doing this now, okay. And so they have the kind of ritual where they agree to, like, the 7-year term, basically, to be mates. And this is where we get, Ara and Mr. Crepsley kind of out on their own. Now, it's an interesting one in that you think finally, like, they're together, and it's good, but it's also, like, not the best timing ultimately, because she's in a relationship with him at the point at which he's trying to take revenge for what happened to the woman he loved, basically. And it's this kind of weird thing where she can't quite get as close to him as she wants to, but enjoys kind of helping him on this mission where they're basically seeking out Vampanese and trying to get information on where Randall Chain is. And I like this because this is sort of, I suppose, very representative of the Mr. Crepsley-Ara relationship, where at the right time, if they got together, you kind of feel it would have been like the absolute perfect match. And they're still good for each other. They're still like friends, and it's a good relationship ultimately for, I think, both of them to have. It's just, it never becomes what you maybe think it could become just because of other things happening, basically, to Mr. Crepsley. And so we get this really interesting idea where obviously there's a lot of this hunting that goes on, and he's beginning to find out that, like, there's little bits and pieces. Some Vampanese say they haven't seen him in years. Others say, like, oh yeah, he was over here, he used to go to this town a lot. But it's unclear if, like, they were just sort of giving him one last sort of, like, slightly misleading thing before they died, or how honorable are they kind of truly being right at the end. And yeah, the next thing that happens in the book is they, surprisingly, right as the war is coming to the end, they meet up with Kurta Schmalt, who is basically running these sort of medical kind of facilities to help humans kind of caught up in the final stages of the war. And this is kind of time where they stay there for quite a while, doing this to help Kurta out. Larten kind of likes the idea of helping people again, sort of referencing what happened in like the previous book, where he was sort of told that if you want to make amends for these things you did in the past, little acts of helping people at maybe times you don't expect to can help along the way. And this is, I suppose, for Larten, another one of those moments. But anyway, from there, we have he meets up with kind of Vancha again. They go on to a tour of this monastery. And this becomes important again, because we come back to this a little bit later on. The monastery, and they meet the monks there. But also, they're there for a wedding. And it's a wedding between two Skelks. One of which is Truska, who of course we know from the main series. And basically what we get here is that Larten gets an interest in the monks, but because Ivana is also at the meeting, she sort of convinces him that, yeah, joining the monks right now would not be the right decision for you. And it's this very interesting discussion that she has where she really wishes she could tell him more about what he's kind of meant to do, or what is the right choice for him, basically. But just kind of makes it clear that now is not the time for you to join the monks. You know, you should continue on your mission to find Randall Chain. And it obviously brings up the idea of, like, you know, Larten's life is being manipulated to a certain degree by Mr. Tiny, pushing him in different directions. And as we see, Wester is also kind of being influenced by Mr. Tiny to affect Mr. Crepsley's life. And we get what happens in this book, basically. So, yeah, but basically it's just another, like, 20 years pass, still can't find Randall Chain. All these encounters with Vampanese, he's taking them out. There's even a fun moment of the book where they describe it that, like, at one point he goes to, like, Australia and just basically challenges all the Vampanese in Australia. And it's just noted that he basically drove the Vampanese out of Australia. It's just a kind of fun little thing in the book, highlighting that he has killed quite a few Vampanese, and it's not just that he stands out among the vampires, he truly is the fighter we know him to be in the main saga. So then we get this really interesting section of the book where Larten goes back to New York at this point, where Silva is staying. And of course, at this point, she is basically the same age as her mother was when she died, again highlighting the passage of time. And she is more or less at this point forgiven Larten for what happens. They have a much better relationship now, reminiscent of the first chapter in the book, very much so. And he decides to bring her to the Cirque du Freak as, like, a fun thing, to meet up with all these friends that he knows, of course. And this is where he joins the Cirque again, to do these performance acts, doing the escape act with Mr. Tull. Really fun stuff, and she stays around for the next couple of nights. And so this is him staying there for quite a while. But then a bunch of the other characters sort of show up at this point. I think it's does Vancha show up at this point? I think he does. Wester shows up, and Gavner, I think. They're all there. And there's this really interesting moment at the end of the show. They're all talking, and Larten notices that Silva is, like, scared, and she just kind of walks off. And so after he finishes talking to his vampire friends, he goes to meet up with Silva where she is. And this is where the big reveal comes out, where it's just like, I'm sorry I have to tell you this, but you've been betrayed. I especially understand what's happened here is because you've been misled and lied to. You never asked me to describe who it was because you said you knew who it was, but now it's very clear that that is not the case. I saw my mother's killer tonight at the show. And they don't say it just yet, but as you cut from that chapter to the next chapter, you sort of know what's going on here. And so we basically goes straight to the confrontation. Like, there's no giant section of the book devoted to these two having this confrontation. It just happens basically right after the reveal happens. They meet up, Larten like just gets him to confess basically, and it's a weird one because it is these two brothers basically having this discussion, but it's the discussion about one of their vicious like betrayal of the other. It's just this sense where, like, I think Wester knows the second he's caught that he doesn't really stand a chance in this fight, but Larten is going to have this fight. And yeah, there's no real issue here. Just Larten wins, kills Wester, buries him like in the kind of middle of nowhere, doesn't mark his grave. And the idea is that he never returns to that grave. The only time he ever thinks about Wester is basically in his dreams. And the most telling point, I think, of all is as we go into the final section of the book to kind of catch us up to the start of the main series, he goes to the monastery after this and actually spends like a full decade there, basically, kind of calming down after the crazy events of what has just happened. This is where he gets Madame Octa from the monks there at the temple. That's where he sort of learns to kind of control her and so on. And after this, he joins Cirque du Freak again. And this is where he starts the performances with Madame Octa. In a very interesting Mr. Tall moment where he already has like the sign prepared as he arrives back at the Cirque du Freak camp, saying that, and Larten Crepsley will be performing with Madame Octa. So this is where we go from he typically performs as Quicksilver, but now he's performing by his actual name. So that's very, very cool. And yeah, this is where he becomes the performer. He spends his years here. At this point, we are caught up to the main series, and there's just one moment basically before we get to the encounter with Steve and Darren. And that is, we get the moment where I think it's Vancha brings Truska to the Cirque du Freak. So we see her join the Cirque. And we get an interesting connection, very interesting connection between all the stuff from this book. It is revealed that Truska's husband was killed by murderous fishermen. And so they never fully say the details of this, but I think the takeaway you're meant to have from this is that Spitz Abrams, Daniel Abrams, was the one who killed Truska's husband. And so this is how she basically ends up at the Cirque du Freak. But obviously it's Vancha and Larten meeting up again, and it's Vancha noting that, like, hey, you know, what are you doing here? You know, like, you're still a super well-respected vampire. You could come back to the mountain anytime you want. Like, pretty much the idea is that, like, throughout the book there were clear moments at which, if you want to, people will support you to become a prince if you want. But no. And so Vancha's just like, is there anything you want to send back to Seba about what happened? Like, and basically asked the question. And also Wester, he hasn't been heard from in quite a while. Do you know anything about what happened to him? And he just tells Vancha to send back this kind of message that is, let me get the exact wording here. Tell him I do not know any vampire of that name. And Vancha just accepts it and goes off. And this helps to explain the really obvious thing that could seem like a continuity error between the series of, like, how is such an important character to Larten never mentioned once throughout all of the main series? This is why. So heavily betrayed that he deals with it and just basically never addresses it again. It is fully done. That is the one thing above all else from his past that he just never wants to talk about again, what happened with Wester. And that's why the character never gets brought up. Even though we have scenes of, like, Larten talking to Seba and all this other stuff, I don't think there's any allusion to it, like, whatsoever, if I remember correctly from the main series. So that's a big moment. And then we get to the connection moment between the two series. He's giving the performance, he spots someone in the audience, and it's just noted, he notes that like whenever he comes out on stage, everyone is scared of the spider because people don't like spiders. So everyone focuses on the spider rather than him. But he notices Steve in the crowd looking at him with the shocked reaction. And that Darren is beside him, one of the most excited in a way he's ever seen someone at seeing a spider. And there's just this sense in him, destiny basically, that these two boys are going to be important in some way. And so we cut to then him waiting for the big kind of meeting after the show, and he notes that like, oh, there's Darren getting the position in the background so he can watch Larten and Steve have their interaction. And then Steve comes out, and that's basically where the book ends. The one thing I'll mention about this scene that I find very interesting is that in a way this whole series has been about Larten and all these kind of crisis of confidences that he has over the course of his years. All the little issues that sort of push him off track, get him back onto track, change his direction. But here's in a way one of the first times in the series where he's just kind of like, he knows something is about to change here, and he just chooses to sort of in a way like barrel on into it, that like, if this is my destiny, so be it. I'll see how this actually plays out. And it's just the idea that it's him finally sort of accepting everything that's just going to happen to him. And again, I think that's a pretty good ending for this series. And in general, it was really fun going back through this to kind of remember it all, because like I said at the start, there was so much about this series specifically on a kind of detail level, even a broad level, that I didn't remember. Like, I remembered that like the ending of the series is Wester and Larten fighting, but I had actually forgotten, like in a way, how somewhat inconsequential in the overall series Wester actually is, outside of the big impact that he ends up having on Larten. Because I sort of almost remembered this series as more of like, it's those two together, but then you realize like, oh yeah, it is at times. But then there's a lot of time of Larten and X character and Y character and so on. Instead, it's like it says, it's a big character focus on Larten and him as the other characters come into his life. And I just really like the series. Like, it's always going to be a tricky one when you do this, where you basically have to cover close to 200 years of a character's life in 4 books. Meaning like, okay, you have to create a true story, but you also have to be like, and here's what happened in these years. And so yes, for instance, a lot of book 2 was sort of a case of, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and we weren't staying with anything too long until the final sequence with the boat. But I think we did eventually get to stuff like where I'd say most of this book I felt was focused on a, even though it's a long period of time still in this book, but a period of time where it was really laser focused on a couple of things and a few characters, and we weren't just skipping across to random things all too much. We still did the obvious kind of connections that we needed to, in terms of where does he get Madame Octa from, here's the sort of intro to the little people, kind of more or less as far back as we've sort of seen them, and all of these kind of little details all, in my mind, work really, really well. And the thing I almost completely had forgotten about is just that stuff like Larten's relationship with Alicia, and then Larten's relationship with Silva later on. Those work, I think, very, very well over the course of things. Even the Aris stuff, I thought was like, given what we know about them from the main series, and it's sort of like a what could have been situation, I thought the writing for like what actually happened to create the kind of what would have been situation was actually pretty good. That both in terms of romantic stuff, but also in terms of like competing against each other, they were just things that they just didn't quite organize it at the right time to make it truly happen. And it's a bit of a kind of tragic relationship of kind of what could have been. So, I've super enjoyed going back through this series and getting into the details on this series. I think it's a strong prequel to this, and I think that it was the right decision to do it like this, in that instead of perhaps going for a full, like, say, 12-book series mirroring the Saga of Darren Shan and trying to tell it in that exact same way, to be a little bit more like the greatest hits of Larten Crepsley's life, I think was actually the better decision, even if kind of structure-wise it made one or two of the books maybe feel a little bit disjointed because we were skipping around so much. But I would say definitely, especially 3 and 4 together, I think created a pretty clear-cut story that was, I think, quite well done. And like I said, the stuff that I'd maybe been a little bit concerned about in the middle books, of like, are they going down that road with Larten a few too many times, where the sudden crisis of confidence comes up again. But the reveals for like why that happened, with Wester being behind it, justified doing it again here this last time, because it is this sort of situation of like, Larten, you felt, had truly kind of found himself in those early stages of this book, and that just changed the trajectory again. And it's, again, like, what could have been. But again, that's the whole thing with, like, destiny in this book, in a way, of like, depending on what time you talk about, Larten's destiny could have been to die much earlier than he expected if Mr. Tiny hadn't interfered in, like, say, Greenland. At another point, he could have been an amazing prince and been this incredible leader of the clan, and that would have worked. All these kind of potential options for him, but Mr. Tiny ultimately wants the best war possible, and that is the War of the Scars, and what happens there. And this is just part of those manipulations. And obviously, with Wester's side of things, we do find out that it was Mr. Tiny coming to him, revealing that basically, oh yeah, the Vampanese, the hatred of the Vampanese is going to completely fall apart. But maybe if you, got Larten on your side, maybe if someone hurt someone close to Larten, the Vampanese did, maybe that would work. And that's all it took. It's one of the more direct Mr. Tiny, like, causing someone so much pain moments, but it's very fitting for that character and what he's like. So, with regards to, like, okay, will I be reviewing more Darren Shan books? It's one of those things where I'm never going to close the door on that, but I don't want to jump into doing it, like, immediately. Next, if I was to do stuff, I would do the Demonata series, starting with Lord Loss. That's a series I also really, really like and would like to reread at some point. So I'd say just kind of like keep an eye on the channel. Like, again, I'm not saying in a couple of months. This is the sort of thing where it's like maybe towards the end of next year, if things aren't super busy with other videos, maybe then I'll do it. Maybe it might be the year after. We'll have to just wait and see on that. But I would like to do that at some point. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on the final book of the Saga of Larten Crepsley, Brothers to the Death. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.